This video is brought to you by the good folks at KEH. Not only is KEH the oldest and biggest at what they do, buying and selling exclusively used camera gear of all sorts since 1979, but they do it well, with integrity and both a 180-day warranty and 21-day return policy, free shipping on transactions over $49. Which is why, because they make it as futz-free a process as possible, they are our go-to whenever we are looking to fund new purchases by selling our own gear or buying that special used piece of kit properly graded and checked when we want to go quirky or old school. Check them out using the special links and 5% discount or bonus code in the video description below. Thank you, KEH. Hey everybody, I'm Hugh Brownstone for Three Blind Men and an Elephant, and today we wrap up our three-part special Leica edition of our Budget Gourmet series. Now, in part one, we discussed how to get into the Leica M system in a relatively budget-friendly way through buying used Leica cameras and lenses. I gave you my recommendations for both. In part two, we explored how to get into the Leica M system in a more budget-friendly way through buying differently. That is, buying M-mount compatible non-Leica gear such as Zeiss Voigtlander or TT Artisan lenses, along with a quick look at some non-Leica 35mm rangefinder cameras like the Zeiss Icon and the Bessa R3. I gave my recommendations using this approach as well. But today, I'm going to ask you to think differently. That is, explore a path that is potentially and simultaneously the least expensive and most technologically advanced way of getting not into Leica per se, but instead getting into the vibe or joy of the Leica M experience without necessarily buying or using Leica gear at all. That is, finding the most economical path for you to achieve your sense of the Leica experience by getting exceptional clarity about precisely what that experience means. Are you, for example, keying in on the Leica brand per se, rather than the experience of shooting with a true 35mm film rangefinder? If so, what is the Leica brand? Put differently, what are the brand's attributes? What are the implicit promises the company makes, from your perspective, when you purchase a Leica camera? It's not the same for everyone, but those who are fans of the brand would probably agree on some or all of the following as attributes of the brand. Things like mechanical precision, build quality, jewel-like manual focus lenses with real aperture rings, image quality, simplicity, industrial design, compact dimensions, heritage, and expense. Many of us may think simply that Leica is synonymous with 35mm film, rangefinder, street photography, Cartier-Bresson. You get the idea. You may have other attributes or associations you'd like to share in the comments section below, so please do. The overarching promise of owning a Leica for a Leica fan, which for some of us, including yours truly, typically means only those Leicas designed and manufactured in Germany, is that owning and using a Leica will feel special. That using a Leica will inspire you. That you can travel relatively lightly, shoot unobtrusively, and of course, obtain outstanding results, although let's all agree, that last one is on us as the photographers. On the other hand, for those of us who aren't fans of the brand, and that's fine, there is no thing, no person universally loved, other attributes like overpriced, overhyped, and overrated are more likely come to the fore. Okay, but like anything, one's sense of a Leica is a function of the sum total of one's life's experiences. And this is where opportunity lies. Because if we can parse and prioritize what Leica means to you, a slew of less expensive or more interesting options opens to you. Let's say, for example, that to you, using a Leica begins with 35mm film. You like the look, you like the idea of the randomness of the silver halide grain, you think you'll like the trade-offs among size, image quality, and convenience a 35mm film camera can offer you. You may embrace the slower pace of shooting, the feel of advancing the film after each shot by using a single, double, or multi-stroke advance lever. The satisfaction that comes from slowly moving the focus ring and watching that small rangefinder path synchronize. The joy of using the engraved depth of field scale on the lens barrel for zone focusing and becoming expert at recognizing what a person 10 feet away from you looks like through the viewfinder when using, say, a 50mm lens. So maybe, if you don't already own a Leica, you are thinking, since you've begun this hypothetical or not so hypothetical journey in terms of a Leica, an M6. Until you see the price, around $3,700 these days for one in excellent condition body only. Another $2 or $3 grand, maybe more, for a used Summicron M2835 or 50 f2 to go with it. Maybe you then start exploring earlier M's, going all the way back to the original 1954 M3, but then learn it has no light meter, nor 28mm frame lines. Maybe you begin thinking of moving past the M6 to the newer, though still no longer made, M7, especially when you learn that unlike current cameras, the M6 has no auto exposure modes at all. But the M7 has aperture priority. But if you can let go of the Leica brand per se, there are a number of fascinating alternatives out there, as I just alluded to, for a lot less, especially if you're willing to forego a true rangefinder. Let's just scratch the surface of what's available to you for a small fraction of the price of used M's and M glass. Many people start their 35mm film journey, for example, with something like the 80s era Canon Ae1 program. It's a very competent, consumer-grade 35mm film SLR, generally available used for around $300. It's a small, light, easy-loading, easy-shooting, auto-exposure-controlled camera with a huge lens catalog of Canon's manual focus FD lenses, ranging in focal length from 7.5mm to 800mm. I bought one new back in the day, and the auto exposure was wow. But if you relax your requirement for the camera being small, you could also buy a freaking 1990s era pinnacle Nikon, the F5, for just $500, body only. It also has a huge lens catalog, but now that you've got a pro-grade weather-sealed body with you, with 8 frames per second burst rate and autofocus, yahoo! Then again, both of these camera systems are far afield from the feel and simplicity of Leica M, I readily admit. Which is why I can recommend you take a very close look instead at one of what I think is the greatest vintage 35mm camera bargains out there today, Canon's 1972 f1, which I also bought new back in the day. Like this guy. Superb feel and precision, a breakthrough camera with interchangeable finders, and Canon's evolution to eventual market leader. It was Canon's answer to another legendary 35mm film camera, the 1960 Nikon F. Louder shutter sound in either case than an M because, like all SLRs, they use mirrors. Then again, yeah, what about a 1960 Nikon FTN? It could be an answer for you. Or an F2, an F3, you get the point. Maybe the smaller, less expensive, non-interchangeable prism Nikkormat. Maybe Canon's competitor to the Nikkormat, the FTQL, like this. I just did that with an R5, by the way. These cameras have the same mechanical heft as a Leica M. The FTQL even has the same kind of bottom release as the M series. Right there. Only now it pops open the back instead of the bottom, making it much easier to load. In fact, QL stands for quick load. Or what about the surprising, and I bet most of you have never heard of this, Bessler Topcon Super D with interchangeable finders that came out 3 years before that original Nikon F? Maybe a 1975 Contax RTS or 2001 N1. Beautiful, I think, though. Do you see what I do? I think that the N1 looks a lot like the Fujifilm X-T4, or is it the other way around? What about other smaller, quintessential, highly regarded, all-metal, manual 35mm film cameras that were doing their best to bury the rangefinder altogether back in the 60s and 70s? Pentax, Spotmatic, Minolta SRT 101, Miranda, Sensorex, Olympus, OM1. But let's say you don't want to abandon your quest for a rangefinder. No pentaprism hump or innumerable switches allowed. I get it. You might take a look at an early 70s Canonet G3 QL17 with its integrated 41.7 or an early 90s Nikon 35 Ti with integrated 35 2.8, both with true rangefinder focusing. Although, as with many cameras from this era, discontinued battery models can become an issue. Not insurmountable, just something of which to be aware. Maybe you want something rangefinder-y because, yeah, for most people, rangefinders are more difficult to focus than SLRs. There's the tiny and quite unique Raleigh 35S, though, with no focusing aids, zone focus only, baby. Or the 90s era and larger autofocusing Konica Hexar RF. Or if you aren't wedded to 35mm, take a look at the novel half-frame 35mm Pen F. It looks like a rangefinder until you realize there's no viewfinder, not because there's no focusing, but because it's actually got a poroprism inside that incredibly small body, and it offers interchangeable lenses. What if all of this is just making you progressively more frustrated and you insist upon getting as close to an original Leica M as possible without the expense? Not including what we've already covered in the first 2 episodes. Well, take a look at the 50s era Nikon S2 with its own proprietary Nikon S mount. It isn't built like an M, but an S2 body can be had for under $500. But if what you want is, as some have argued, a modern 35mm film interchangeable lens rangefinder that is actually better than a Leica M from the same era, you must look at the 1990s era autofocusing using an electronically coupled rangefinder, no less, with built-in viewfinder zoom for framing, auto-exposing Contax G2 with its own proprietary G-mount and lenses made specifically for it by Zeiss. When you can find one, it's likely to go for somewhere between $1,300 body only and as much as $3,000 or more for the body with several of the Zeiss primes. But a dear friend of mine loved his. Although, last time we spoke, I think he was heading towards a digital Leica CL. Which is a nice segue to this. What if, the more you think about it, you decide you want more of the mod cons, as the Brits would say, like autofocus and auto exposure and interchangeable lenses, and actually, you want digital workflow? I get it. And I've got a few more ideas for you. If you can live without full frame, take a look at a used Fujifilm X Pro 2, for example, with a used XF16 1.4. This is a sub-$2,000 combination with my favorite wide-angle field of view, and the 16 1.4 in particular is one of my favorite lenses of all time. But what makes the 16 1.4 special beyond the image quality in this context is that this autofocusing lens also has a manual focus clutch with hard stops at minimum focusing distance and infinity, which is outstanding and so rare. Or take a peek at Fujifilm's X-E4 with 27mm 2.8, a full-frame equivalent field of view and depth of field of 40f4 for $1,150 all in, new, although yeah, I don't really like the 27 2.8 for manual focusing. You can pick up a used X100F with integrated 23f2, full-frame equivalent field of view and depth of field of a 35 2.8, say, for $940, though again, I don't love the lens for manual focus. What if you want small-size digital workflow, rangefinder-y body, and the ability to use manual focus-only glass? I really like the Sony A7C with a Canon FL or FD to Sony adapter for use with, say, a sub-$600 super spectra-coated Canon 85 1.8. We're talking au courant full-frame digital workflow behind a vintage manual focus lens that many of us would call full of character. Swappable in less than 10 seconds for one of the best lenses ever made, say Sony's kick-ass autofocusing 135 1.8 G Master, or TT Artisan's very surprising manual focus only Summilux M inspired sub $600 90 1.25 or sub $350 1.4 in native Sony E-mount. These are a couple of great combos. Then again, a French company has just introduced a true digital rangefinder camera with M mount and a version of the 26.1 megapixel APS-C sensor found in the X-E4 called the Pixie. Although that puppy is selling new for $3,000 and in its earliest days. Breathe. Before we call it a day, let's explore another direction altogether. Let's say you place heritage high up on your list. Film too, of course, and you are, when you think about it, not wedded to 35mm film, but don't want to go smaller. Let's say you place image quality above camera size. Would you consider jumping up to medium format? Because if you do, things get really interesting from where I sit. On the film front, how about the Hasselblad 500 series, the 6x6, 2¼ square film SLR of the 20th century with incredible heritage dating back to 1948, serving as perhaps the fashion and portrait camera system through the 1970s. What of the Raleigh Flex 2.8, the 6x6 twin lens reflex camera introduced in 1949, but based on the very first Raleigh Flex released in 1929. This is another canonical camera from a canonical brand used by so many legendary photographers of the 20th century. If you like the idea of medium format film photography for less, take a look at the far more accessibly priced Mamiya C330 or Yashica Mat 124G, or at the tail end of the 20th century, and one of my favorite cameras of that century, the legendary Contax 645 SLR. And then there's the ultimately ill-fated but also fabulous Raleigh Flex 6000 series 6x6 SLRs. Not that these last two don't have their challenges as we enter the third decade of the 21st century, but still, these are really, really interesting cameras and will give you much of the Leica experience depending on how you define it. And in the digital world, before I forget, I'm on record as saying that shooting Hasselblad's medium format EVF-based X1D2 with 45p, that's an f4 lens in manual focus mode, the full frame equivalent of call it a 35 2.8, is the closest thing to shooting a digital M in terms of heritage and image quality other than an M itself. And while not inexpensive, the original X1D with 45 3.5 can be had used for thousands less than a used M6 Summicron M35 combination. I didn't want to make this a long episode, but I very much wanted to explore thinking very differently about Leicas. So first, please, if you haven't already done so, watch parts 1 and 2. I'll include links to both in the description below. But yeah, let's wrap it up by putting it this way for now. In some ways, part 3 has been my attempt to think so far outside of the box that you jump into another box altogether. Remember, this series began with buying only used Leica gear, moved on to Leica M compatible gear without the use of adapters, and now concludes with forsaking the Leica brand altogether in the name of economy while capturing some aspect or aspects of the Leica M experience. As I asked at the outset of this episode, without trying to sway you one way or the other, truly, what parts of the Leica experience do you want? What parts can you do without? Cachet or heritage? As I've just explored, there are other brands that have both. I own a Hassi 500 CM, for example, though I freely admit that from where I sit, none of them matches Leica. Feel, build quality, I'd say that you can get close by looking beyond Leica, but again, no other brand, in my view, can match it. The Canon F1 is one of my favorite cameras of all time too, but in the end, no, it doesn't have the build quality of my M11 or SL2. CL? Well, yes, actually. Film? There are too many film camera choices to review, but I hope my few examples have helped you come to realize that there are, in fact, surprising and fascinating options out there, anywhere from more expensive than an M6 or M3, say, to less than 1/10 the price of either. Unobtrusiveness? There are other cameras out there that are smaller and lighter, and I haven't even mentioned micro four thirds or 1-inch sensor cameras, never mind smartphones, though I probably should have, because, for example, something like Panasonic's LX series of cameras are very small and nice in hand, and something like Sony's RX100 series makes a Leica M feel like a boat anchor. But we do reach a point of diminishing returns, and for me, the RX100 is too small, with image quality too gated by the megapixel count and pitch. What about image quality? There are other cameras out there for less money that in fact offer superior image quality to some Leicas, although I did not mention that the camera with the highest image quality I've ever used is Fujifilm's GFX100S digital medium format system. I think it's an incredible camera at an incredible price. Great lenses too, yet for me it embodies too few of the attributes I associate with Leica to have included it in this quick survey, except to say, respect. But even then, I am more than content with the 60 megapixel sensor of my M11, mated to my Elmar 24 3.8 or non-Apo Summicron M50, or for that matter, Voigtlander's Apo Lanther 35 2.0 or Apo Scopar 92.8. And to my way of thinking, this is a quintessential Leica M kit. But you do not need to spend nearly as much to get close or even better image quality because of autofocus and outright optical lens performance from Sony's A7R4, Nikon's Z7 series, Panasonic's S1R, Canon's R5, or Sigma's FPL, and the best lenses available in each mount. The actual rangefinder experience, flexibility. It turns out that in 2022, an interchangeable lens mirrorless camera with even a 3.7 million dot EVF and good rear screen is a far superior tool to a true rangefinder for ease of composition and focus for most of us, either by autofocus or by focusing manually. Combined with the breadth, depth, and performance of the latest lenses coming from Sony, Canon, and Nikon, it is only fair to acknowledge that there is pretty much nothing these camera systems can't do. But at the end of the day, as we close out for today, there is only one company that can deliver the full Leica experience, as I define it, for me, which is why I also own an SL2 and CO-based system. Only one company that can deliver the full Leica rangefinder experience at any price. And that company remains, as I suppose it should. A big shout out to KEH for sponsoring this video, a great resource for finding just this kind of gear. Check them out using the special links and 5% discount or bonus code in the video description below. Thank you, KEH. If you like what you've seen here today, please give a thumbs up, subscribe, join the conversation below because this is an incredible audience. If you'd like a copy of our Streets of New York, the book, head over to www.3bmep.com/books. If you'd like to schedule a one-on-one video session with me for a portfolio review, explore or hone your artistic voice, select gear, and more, sign up at www.3bmep.com/booking. Finally, consider supporting our work by using our no-cost-to-you affiliate links down below, picking up some official Three Blind Men and an Elephant swag at 3bmep.threadless.com, sending coffee money via PayPal, or best of all, join us as a patron over at Patreon. However you choose to support us, as always, we thank you for it.